Hey everybody, it's Dr. Hesser here, and we are ready for our last chapter, chapter 27, when we cover the reproductive system. I'll tell you that this recording, part 1 of chapter 27, will cover the male reproductive system, and part 2 will cover the female reproductive system. Before we get started too far into this chapter, I just want to say that since this is our last chapter and we are, in this weird situation, we're running out of time a little bit. And so I have taken some things out of chapter 27, mainly things dealing with meiosis, actions of spermatogenesis and oogenesis, which I'll mention and define in these lectures, but we can't get into the specifics of that, even though I did assign a set of questions on that in your pre-lecture homework because it's really important. We just don't have enough time to cover it. The other thing I will say is that it is imperative, and I will rely on you guys to learn the anatomy on your own, all right? On the learning objectives, there is a list of anatomy, both male and female, that you need to know. So even though I might not, point out every structure or highlight every structure, you need to know the anatomy if it is on your learning objectives or if it's written on the slide. Okay, I'll pick out highlights and I'll talk about highlights of different anatomy, but I won't be able to point out and cover everything that you need to know. Just a brief overview of the reproductive system, and this is not specific for males. This is for males and females. The first 3 bullet points there are specific to both. So the reproductive system's jobs are to manufacture and house gametes, which are the sex cells, the sperm, and you may be more familiar with the term egg, but the official scientific term for that is ova. The reproductive system, of course, when these 2 gametes come together, produce offspring. And throughout the normal reproductive processes, these structures that we're going to talk about are going to produce various hormones, and those hormones are required for controlling the whole process of reproduction, but also maintaining the secondary sex characteristics, which we will mention for each sex. So females have the added bonus and privilege of carrying the offspring during development within their uterus, which we will talk a little bit more about in part 2. Like I said, I am not going to cover every single piece of this anatomy on this slide. It's imperative for you to look through at each of the anatomy that you are required to know and be able to identify. Okay, think about on an exam, I may have a slide like this that would have you identify just the anatomy, but also identify functions as well. So when you're studying, you need to be covering those things and doing those types of things. So this is a side view or a sagittal view of the male reproductive system. I'm going to talk about a lot of these things as we go along and, refer back to looking at images of these. But what we're going to do is we're going to start in the testes, and then we're going to kind of work our way towards the exit point of the body. So we're going to start in the testes. Now, testes is a plural form of the word. Singular form would be testis, and that's spelled T-E-S-T-I-S. You could also use the word testicle as well. But anyways, plural is testes. Now, the testes are the location of spermatogenesis, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But the testes are surrounded by a layer of skin that's called the scrotum. And the testes themselves are made up of two different layers of tissue, and we call those tunics. Tunic really is just a fancy word for layer. The first is the tunica vaginalis, and that's really just a covering, and that covering is continuous with the peritoneum, and the peritoneum is just a covering that extends down, covers the abdominal cavity, comes down and into the scrotum to cover those testes as well. But the bulk of the testes, and I'll show you on in a couple of slides what I mean by that, is a layer of tissue called the tunica albugini. Now, in the tunica albugini, kind of nestled in there, are these lobules, which are just separations. And inside of those lobules are tubes called seminiferous tubules. This is where sperm are produced. And the sperm are made from special cells that we call spermatogenic cells. And the sperm that are made here are not quite fully mature, and we'll kind of get back to that a little bit. But all of these seminiferous tubules, they are going to come together to form the structure we're going to talk about next that sits on top of the testis, which is called the epididymis. But there are also, within the tunica albugini, there's also cells that are called Leydig cells or interstitial cells, and their job is to produce testosterone. All right, so we're going to come back and talk about spermatogenesis and the hormonal control and all of that here in a little bit. But I will say that the testes are outside of the body, and they're covered in that layer of skin. But underneath that layer of skin, there's a layer of muscle as well. And that muscle can help bring the testes closer to the body or let them relax so the testes are further away from the body. This is based on the fact that the body temperature or the local temperature to make sperm should be a couple of degrees below body temperature. So that's why the testes hang outside of the body. And why, if the surroundings are too cold, then that muscle called the cremaster muscle can sort of contract and bring the testes closer to the body and warm them up a little bit. And alternatively, if the environment is too low, then that muscle can relax and let the testes hang a little bit further so that they're not really getting all of that extra body heat. It's more efficient that way. Okay, so I mentioned that the seminiferous tubules converge into this storage structure called the epididymis. This is where the sperm are stored until ejaculation, and again, we'll come back to that. They're mostly immature, but they can begin to mature a little bit as they gain the ability to move. And then the epididymis then turns into the ductus or vas deferens. The vas deferens then will enter into the body as part of the spermatic cord, and the spermatic cord is going to have other things in it like blood vessels and nerve supply, but that is what enters into the body. And ultimately, the vas deferens are going to become the ejaculatory duct once they combine with a short duct that's coming from the seminal vesicles. All right, so we'll be able to see all that a little bit later. What I want you to focus on in this slide here is you can see the testis, you can see a testis, and it really does in this picture look like an egg, and instead of a nice egg yolk inside, you see all these squiggly yellow lines. So the white part of that testis is the tunica albugini. Okay, that's the bulk of the testis. But the seminiferous tubules, which are the yellow cords there, the yellow tubes, those are the seminiferous tubules. Inside of those tubules are where the sperm are produced. We're going to look at that a little bit closer on the next slide. All right, but as you can see, all those yellow tubules lead to sort of an orange structure on the left called the rete testis. But even past that, those lead into a structure that sits sort of on top of the testis. That is the epididymis. All right, and so that epididymis will converge into one primary tube, and then once it gets all the way to the bottom of the testis and turns that corner to come back up, that's when it is considered to be the vas deferens, and that's when it enters into the spermatic cord and enters into the body. I'll also point out here that you can see the tunica vaginalis. Remember, that's really just a covering layer for everything, and you can see that it covers the testis. It also is what is going to surround the epididymis. It's going to line the inside of the scrotum, so you have lots of different layers of the tunica vaginalis, but it really is mainly just a covering. Next, I want us to take a look inside of a seminiferous tubule. So this would be found inside of the testis, and this is a cross-section of a seminiferous tubule. On the outer rim of those seminiferous tubules, so like on the inside, but along the outer perimeter, you've got spermatogenic cells. Those are the ones that actually become sperm. And those are going to be found in between cells called Sertoli cells, or they're also called sustentacytes. We're going to come back to those in a little bit, talk about the Sertoli and the Leydig cells a little bit more and what their roles are. But those are the cells that are within the seminiferous tubules, the spermatogenic cells and the Sertoli cells. Now, as sperm are produced, they start at the perimeter of those tubes, and they go through multiple stages of meiosis as they move towards the center or the lumen of the seminiferous tubule, because they want to stay in there. Because ultimately, remember, those seminiferous tubules are going to be funneled into the epididymis and then into the vas deferens. But outside of the seminiferous tubules, so we're still within the testis, we're still within the tunica albuginea, but outside of the seminiferous tubules, you have the interstitial cells that are also called Leydig cells. Okay, the word interstitial really means in between the cells. So these interstitial cells are going to be found in between the seminiferous tubules. So again, we'll come back to the functions of the Leydig and the Sertoli cells when we get to the hormonal control of everything. As the sperm are ejaculated from the epididymis through the vas deferens, the sperm pass by a number of accessory glands, and those accessory glands contribute a lot of different things to the product that is semen. So the semen would be all of these other contributions plus the sperm themselves. Now remember, once these sperm are ejaculated, they're not fully mature and they're not completely able to move. So the accessory glands are going to help them with that, but they're also going to contribute a lot of fluid to help the sperm move along in their quest. And the seminal fluid is going to not just be, literal fluid, but it's contributing things to that fluid, like fructose. Fructose is good to give those sperm energy. It is going to provide an alkaline buffer to prevent the sperm from damage once they reach the acidic environment of the female vagina. Prostaglandins help with smooth muscle contractions, and those smooth muscle contractions are going to help them get to the vagina, but also help them once they get there and move around a little bit. And there's also a coagulating enzyme that is provided. That coagulating enzyme, actually, once the semen is received by the female, that coagulation occurs, and it's sort of like a sticky mass, and it actually prevents the sperm from coming back out of the female. So it kind of locks them in there to do their job. So all of that comes from the seminal vesicles. The prostate gland is also an accessory to this. It supplies more fluid. It's going to give more sugars, more enzymes that are going to help allow the sperm to achieve full maturity. And then lastly, the bulbourethral glands are going to provide mucus, which is going to help with lubrication, and this will help in the act of copulation. The urethra is the next tube that we're going to see in the process, which is actually going to be the tube that's going to deliver the semen outside of the man's body. So remember, we had the vas deferens. Okay, so the vas deferens passed by those seminal vesicles, and the seminal vesicle tube combined with the vas deferens to form this very quick duct called the ejaculatory duct. The ejaculatory duct, as it moves through the prostate, then becomes the urethra. Okay, and the urethra, for the male at least, is going to be the output for not only the reproductive system and semen, but also the urinary system as well. But the urethra is separated into 3 regions based on the location. Again, that prostatic urethra is going to be found there in the prostate gland. Then there's the membranous urethra, which is just the area that's going to pass from the inside of the body to the outside of the body through the urogenital diaphragm. And then the spongy urethra is going to go through the bulk of the penis until it gets to the external urethral orifice, which is the output. That spongy urethra is going to travel through the penis, which is the copulatory organ. Of course, its job to deliver sperm. The bulk of it is erectile tissue, and erectile tissue is really just a connective tissue that has a lot of spaces inside of it, and we'll talk about how those spaces contribute to erection in just a few slides. But depending on whether that tissue surrounds that urethra or whether it surrounds some of the major arteries within the penis, it has a different name to it. So the corpus spongiosum is that layer of erectile tissue that directly surrounds the urethra, and then the corpus cavernosum is the erectile tissue that directly surrounds those primary arteries. So if you look at the picture of the cross-section of the penis there, to me, it kind of looks like the face of a monkey or a bug, if you will. And so there's 2 red eyeballs, and those are going to be 2 of the main arteries. Again, we'll talk about the function of those arteries here in just a little bit. But this tissue around those main arteries, that's the corpus cavernosum. And then the mouth of the monkey or the bug, whatever you want to think of it, that's the spongy urethra. Okay, that's the label for that area of the urethra, the spongy urethra. So directly surrounding that, there's erectile tissue called the corpus spongiosum. Okay, so spongy urethra, spongiosum. That's a good way to remember that. So guys, I'm not going to talk too much about this slide, but it is really important for you to trace the path that the sperm would take starting from their production in the testis. And I think it's important for you to take some time to do that and, identify all the structures like the ductus deferens and the seminal glands, the ejaculatory duct, bulbourethral glands, all those things, and be able to identify where each of those things are, but also be able to identify the functions of each of those. So what types of things do the seminal glands contribute? Or what is the name of the urethra as it moves through the penis? That kind of thing. Those types of things are really important to understand on a figure like this and make sure that you can identify all the things that we've talked about to this point. So I encourage you to take some time, even right now, pause the video and walk yourself through that. We're going to move from anatomy more into physiology now. So if there's still some anatomy pieces that you're not familiar with, I would encourage you to go back and look whenever you need to, because we're going to focus really more on the phys right now. Okay, so let's start with that male sexual response. So the male sexual response has two parts to it: erection followed by ejaculation. So those two things are different. And they are actually controlled by the different pieces of the autonomic nervous system. So erection is going to be triggered by the parasympathetic nervous system, or the PNS, by a local release of nitric oxide into the corpus cavernosum. All right. So what happens is that nitric oxide allows the main arteries in the penis to dilate. If you're remembering on a couple of slides ago, we're talking about the red eyeballs of the face of the monkey. But those arteries dilate, and that allows extra blood to come in and fill up the spaces of the erectile tissue. And so that's going to be the blood engorgement, specifically of the corpus cavernosum. Now, the word corpora, that is plural of corpus. All right, so the corpus cavernosum specifically, the two red eyeballs, the tissue that surrounds those. Now, the corpus spongiosum doesn't do that because it surrounds the urethra, and the urethra is going to need to stay open for the next part, which is ejaculation. All right, so nitric oxide is probably something you have heard of before if you've heard of that little blue pill called Viagra, because that's basically what it is. It allows for that constant dilation. So next we have ejaculation. This is triggered by the sympathetic nervous system, and it's a reflex mediated by the spinal cord, and it causes all the ducts, the vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, the urethra, and the accessory glands. It causes them all to contract, which is going to help facilitate the function and get the semen out of the body, because that is the job. Remember that the sperm, prior to ejaculation, are stored all the way back in the epididymis. Okay, so we're talking at the very beginning of the path. So they have kind of a long way to go, and as they pass by each of the accessory glands, they pick up a little bit more until they leave the body through the semen. And then at the very end of that, you have vasoconstriction, which is then going to offset the dilation and the actions of nitric oxide, and squeeze the blood back into and out of the erectile tissue, and it actually leaves through the major veins that are coming out of the penis. I want to very briefly mention the process of spermatogenesis, and that, as a definition, is on that first bullet point. It is how the males produce their gamete, which are called sperm. That occurs again in the seminiferous tubules. We're going to talk a little bit about the hormonal control here in just a few slides, through the cellular division process of meiosis. Spermatogenesis is going to start in a man at puberty, and it is going to continue constantly happening throughout the vast majority of that man's life, which is very, very different than what we're going to see in terms of the female. The structure of a sperm itself, it has three pieces to it, starting with a head, the midpiece, and then the tail. So the head, of course, has all the DNA, but it also has this part called the acrosome, which is on the very tip of the head, and it actually is going to contain enzymes that help with fertilization, which is going to be when the sperm meet up with the egg, and the act of those two gametes combining. And then, of course, the tail is this whip-like propeller called the flagellum, and that helps it move around once it gets into the female. Prior to that, moving through the male, it moves through a lot of just fluid movement, kind of hopping along for the ride. because when it's being stored, when spermatogenesis occurs, and it looks like a sperm, its storage in the epididymis during that time, it can't really move around. It's not really fully matured. So a little bit of that can start in the epididymis, but that final maturation and motility doesn't happen until the accessory glands provide their secretions, and that doesn't happen until ejaculation. Okay, so all the energy and the buffers and all of those things we talked about with the seminal vesicles, the prostate, and the bulbourethral glands, those things are the contributions that help final maturation, that let that sperm be able to fertilize the egg, allow it to move around, and survive in that harsh environment of the vagina. Really, the last thing I want to talk about here is the hormonal regulation of the male reproductive system. And really what we're talking about here is the regulation of sperm production. That's the major reproductive process that males undergo, that continual production of sperm. And this is all through the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPG, which we'll see again when we get to the females because it's very similar to this. But the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, and that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. We'll see this on the next slide. You can kind of follow along again. I'll walk you through it one more time. FSH, specifically its target cells are the Sertoli cells, or those cystinocytes. That's another word for Sertoli cells. And that is going to allow for a few things. Number one, written on the slide here, it is going to allow those Sertoli cells to release androgen binding protein, or ABP, androgen binding protein. That's going to be important for that next step, which I'll come back to here in just a minute. The other thing that the Sertoli cells allow for is the Sertoli cells are going to help support the sperm as they are developing. That's the job of the Sertoli cells. They support the sperm as they're developing, and they release ABP. Now, ABP is going to help testosterone get into the Sertoli cells. That is one way that the Sertoli cells help support the developing sperm. They've got to have that testosterone. Where does the testosterone come from? It's from the Leydig cells. And the Leydig cells secrete testosterone because of LH from the anterior pituitary. Testosterone, again, as it's written here, it's the trigger for spermatogenesis within the testis to say, hey, go ahead, keep up this production of sperm or ramp it up. And that is going to be through sort of a homeostatic mechanism. But other than that, so more systemically, we're going, specifically at puberty, testosterone is going to help for the development and maturation of the sexual organs and the secondary sex characteristics. And throughout the man's life, it is going to be helping them maintain their sexual drive. This is the levels of testosterone are tightly regulated through negative feedback. As I mentioned, I'd walk you through this process again and how the HPG is going to go. So again, we start from the very top where the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then is going to release two hormones, FSH and LH. Okay, those two hormones act on two different populations of cells. So let's start with FSH first. FSH goes to the Sertoli cells, or the cystinocytes. All right, those are cells inside of the seminiferous tubules that contain the spermatogenic cells. Okay, the spermatogenic cells are the ones that become the sperm, but the Sertoli cells support those as they are developing. So the Sertoli cells provide support for the spermatogenic cells. Part of that support is producing ABP, androgen binding protein. Okay, so if you go back up to step 4, LH that came from the anterior pituitary causes the interstitial cells or the Leydig cells to release the testosterone. Now, the testosterone cannot get into the sustentacytes or the Sertoli cells without ABP. So the ABP allows the testosterone to move in to access the developing sperm to help them finish their development. All right. So again, testosterone, that's its local effects. It also has systemic effects of a number of different things, and some of them we will talk about on the next slide. What I do want to mention at the very end here that was not written on the previous slide, but I want to highlight it here, is the negative feedback mechanism. So there's 2 negative feedback mechanisms at work here, and those are labeled 6 and 7 on this slide. The first is a negative feedback via testosterone. This negative feedback, the increasing levels of testosterone, affects LH more so than any other hormone. All right, so as testosterone increases, it causes a decrease of LH from the anterior pituitary. But FSH uses a slightly different mechanism. So that number 7 arrow there, as FSH increases, it causes the sustentacytes or the Sertoli cells to release a different hormone called inhibin. Inhibin, as it increases, is going to have a negative feedback on the production of FSH from the anterior pituitary. So the FSH and the LH are going to have negative feedback mechanisms that control themselves, just 2 slightly different mechanisms. Testosterone is going to have negative feedback on LH, and inhibin is going to have negative feedback on FSH. Remember that inhibin is going to be released from the Sertoli/sustentacytes. Lastly, I just wanted to put a list of the secondary sex characteristics that are traditionally male, and these all are based on testosterone. Okay, so the excessive hair growth, the deep voice, the increased muscle mass and metabolic rate, and the as they like to call it, the roid rage. Just kidding, guys. But the behavior, the mating behavior, and the what goes with mating behavior, but the courtship rituals and that kind of thing. If you want to extrapolate it to all mammals in general, all that's coming from various levels of testosterone. All right, guys, so that is it for part 1 and our male reproductive system. Again, I apologize if I went too fast or if I skipped over something. It certainly is up to you guys to go back through and learn the anatomy, understand the little bit of physiology we talked about at the end. When we get to the female side of this in part 2, it's going to be real heavy on the physiology, so just keep that in mind.